This is not to suggest that Diane, when I met her, was ruthlessly ambitious, but she did make an interesting Freudian slip. She meant to refer to me as a talented young director, but instead she called me a stepping stone. It was a red flag.
Beneath the laughter, something unspoken lingered. Hollywood adored Diane Keaton on screen, but behind the cameras, her independence unsettled its power players. The woman they celebrated was the same woman they quietly resisted. What Woody Allen revealed that night wasn't just a joke, it was a confession. How Hollywood's most unlikely star broke every rule. The story of Diane Keaton and Woody Allen is one of the most intricate collaborations in American cinema. A mix of creative electricity, personal vulnerability, and Hollywood's constant tension between reverence and resentment. Keaton, whose offbeat charisma redefined what it meant to be a leading woman, emerged at a time when the industry was rewriting its own rules. Yet behind her celebrated individuality was a history of rejection, skepticism, and the kind of public misunderstanding that could make even an Oscar winner the subject of controversy.
What I've accomplished in my life, I owe for sure to her.
Before she became the embodiment of quirky sophistication, Diane Keaton was a California outsider with theatrical ambitions. She grew up in a deeply conservative community in Orange County, a background later referenced by Woody Allen himself when describing her origins during a roast at the American Film Institute tribute.
She came from an area of California where Keaton lived. If you helped a blind person across the street, they accused you of socialism.
That humor captured both Allen's dry wit and Keaton's contrasting worldviews. She was unpredictable, eccentric, unpolished by Hollywood's beauty machine, and therefore fascinating. Her rebellion against aesthetic norms became her signature. She dressed to conceal rather than reveal, as Allen once teased.
She dresses, as you know, to hide her sexuality and always has dressed to hide and has done a great job because it's never emerged over years.
In the 1960s, Keaton moved to New York City to pursue acting. She landed a role in the Broadway musical Hair, performing as part of a countercultural ensemble that shocked mainstream America. But Keaton herself refused to conform even there. She reportedly refused to appear fully nude on stage, signaling a lifelong aversion to being boxed into industry expectations. Her unconventional start led her directly to play it again, Sam, the Broadway play that would alter the trajectory of her life. The play was written by Woody Allen, a comedian already recognized for his neurotic intellectualism and irony. Keaton auditioned for the role of Linda Christie, and according to her recollection, her height became the deciding factor. She got the part because she wasn't taller than Allen. That onstage chemistry translated into an offstage relationship, marking the beginning of one of Hollywood's most productive creative partnerships. Keaton and Allen's connection wasn't about glamour. It was built on shared insecurity and humor. She would later call him hilarious, precise, and brutally honest, someone who demanded that she set up the joke rather than deliver it, teaching her how to use awkwardness as art. Allen, for his part, described Keaton as his muse, not because she was predictable, but precisely because she wasn't. Their partnership evolved through a series of films that blurred fiction and autobiography. By the early 1970s, the two had built a rhythm on screen that mirrored their real-life rapport. Neurotic man meets confident yet uncertain woman, and together they expose each other's fragility. But before she became the cinematic emblem of Allen's universe, Keaton's credibility as a serious actress was tested by the film industry itself. Casting directors called her too kooky, a euphemism for her refusal to fit the mold of the idealized female lead. This eccentricity, once considered a liability, would later become the very trait that made her unforgettable. Her cinematic breakthrough came with The Godfather, where she played Kay Adams, the moral conscience opposite Al Pacino's Michael Corleone. Keaton herself believed she was miscast, an outsider in the midst of a hyper-masculine mafia epic. Critics, however, saw something else, a quiet, emotional realism that made her performance indispensable. Off-screen, her admiration for Pacino grew into affection. Their relationship, though brief, became one of Hollywood's most discussed romances. Keaton recalled being captivated by him, describing him as beautiful and so talented. Yet as with many of her relationships, it was fleeting. A pattern Allen later joked about publicly.
She's been involved romantically with a half dozen of the most gifted, charismatic, attractive men in Hollywood, and every one of them has dumped her.
Keaton's most defining role arrived in 1977 with Annie Hall. The film wasn't just a story about love and neurosis. It was in many ways a biographical mirror of Keaton and Allen themselves. The character's name, Annie Hall, was drawn from Keaton's real surname, Hall, and much of her wardrobe in the film came from her personal closet. The now iconic tie, vest, and baggy trousers were Keaton's invention, not the costume designers. It was a cinematic accident that became a fashion revolution. Allen acknowledged that the role could not have existed without her. There's no Annie without Diane. The film went on to win 4 Academy Awards, including Best Actress for Keaton, whose blend of awkwardness and authenticity reshaped Hollywood's idea of femininity. Despite that success, Keaton's reputation inside the industry was far from universally adored. She was unpredictable in interviews, refused to play the Hollywood game, and resisted cosmetic conformity. Allen once quipped that she prefers to look old. For an industry obsessed with image, her defiance was unsettling. Behind the humor, Keaton's private writings revealed more complexity. Allen himself admitted learning things about her only after reading her memoir.
From the minute I met her, she was a great, great inspiration to me. She's much of what I've accomplished in my life.
That she'd struggled with body image and disordered eating. He joked about it publicly in the roast, making light of her vulnerability, while simultaneously expressing affection. This blend of dark humor and intimacy defined their dynamic. Allen's cynicism colliding with Keaton's sincerity. They never married, never rekindled romance after their breakup, but remained lifelong companions. Keaton described their relationship as friendly, enduring, and full of shared memories. Hollywood, however, has always struggled to categorize people like Keaton. To some, she was an auteur's muse. To others, a stubborn nonconformist who didn't know her place. As younger actresses entered the scene, Keaton's old-fashioned defiance stood in sharper contrast. She wasn't chasing youth. She was preserving eccentricity as identity. In interviews, she rejected the idea that not marrying was a failure. She saw it as a choice born of independence, even if it came with loneliness. Through the first 1970s and 1980s, Keaton became synonymous with an entire cultural archetype, the intelligent, offbeat woman who could hold her own against intellectual men while remaining emotionally elusive. That persona was largely shaped by Allen's films, but it belonged to Keaton. Allen himself later admitted as much. She brought her whole self into that role. Even Allen's humor about her idiosyncrasies carried admiration. He credited her with inspiring much of his creative output, saying that much of what I've accomplished in my life, I owe for sure to her. But admiration is not affection in Hollywood terms. For all her success, Keaton was polarizing, celebrated by audiences, yet often dismissed by insiders who saw her refusal to conform as arrogance. Her kooky label followed her well into middle age, even as she collected awards, published books, and began directing. The roots of that perception can be traced to how she handled fame with visible discomfort. Unlike many of her peers, she didn't attempt reinvention through scandal, marriage, or plastic transformation. She aged in public unapologetically, a decision that, while celebrated by some, quietly alienated her from others within the industry, obsessed with perpetual youth. By the time she reached her 60s, Keaton had transcended her status as an actress and become a cultural reference point. Her mannerisms, the halting laugh, the layered clothes, the shy yet witty tone, became shorthand for a certain kind of authenticity. And yet the same traits that made her beloved also made her misunderstood. Allen once ended his tribute to her with an uncharacteristic sincerity.
This is a woman who is great at everything she does. Actress, writer, photographer, philatrix, director.
Beneath the jokes, there was admiration tinged with melancholy, a recognition that Keaton, despite being one of Hollywood's most enduring figures, had never been fully understood by it. This contradiction, beloved by the audience, doubted by the system, defined her relationship with the industry from the beginning. While Allen's world gave her visibility, it also trapped her within a specific narrative that she existed only in orbit, around his genius. Yet as her later work would show, she was far more than anyone's muse. Her story up to this point, from California outsider to Oscar-winning icon, represents the first act of a larger saga. How Hollywood alternately adored and rejected Diane Keaton. How her individuality made her indispensable yet inconvenient. And how the woman once dismissed as too kooky became one of cinema's most complex figures. Woody Allen and Diane Keaton, the bond Hollywood couldn't control. By the early 1980s, Diane Keaton had become more than a performer. She was a cultural phenomenon whose name invoked a style, an attitude, and a way of thinking about womanhood on screen. But within Hollywood, fame often comes with an invisible expiration date. And for Keaton, the tension between admiration and alienation began to widen after Annie Hall. Despite her Oscar success, many in the industry still viewed her through the prism of Woody Allen's universe. The assumption was that she thrived only under his direction, that her eccentric charm required Allen's scripts to translate into something palatable for audiences. Keaton's refusal to follow Hollywood's formula compounded that perception. She declined to fit into the archetype of the glamorous leading lady, resisting conventional romantic comedies and preferring roles that expose flaws rather than fantasies. This independence, once celebrated, began to isolate her. In interviews, she often reflected on her outsider status, describing herself as off-center and a little odd, comments that were received alternately as self-deprecation and defiance. Her next major pivot came in 1981 with Reds, directed by Warren Beatty. The historical epic was both a love story and a political statement, and Keaton's role as journalist Louise Bryant was among the most demanding of her career. Beatty, known for his obsessive approach to film, pushed her relentlessly. She later recalled filming one scene over 60 times. That performance proved her range beyond Allen's influence, earning critical praise and reaffirming that her artistic identity was her own. Still, Hollywood's ambivalence persisted. Keaton's performances were lauded, but her choices often baffled executives who preferred predictability. She alternated between large studio projects and deeply personal films, directed, wrote essays, and explored photography, activities that broadened her reputation as an artist, but made her difficult to market as a star. Throughout this period, Keaton remained loyal to Allen, both professionally and personally. While their romantic relationship had ended years earlier, their creative bond endured.
I didn't know she was bulimic. These things came out in the book. We'd have dinner. She'd tell me that she loved me, and then she'd throw up.
They collaborated again in Manhattan and Radio Days, and their continued friendship was frequently misinterpreted by tabloids as unresolved affection. Yet their connection was more complex, an enduring mutual dependence built on creative understanding and emotional familiarity. When Allen faced growing scrutiny and moral backlash later in his career, Keaton's loyalty became controversial. She continued to praise his talent, even as much of Hollywood distanced itself from him. Many observers criticized her for standing by him, while others saw it as a reflection of her lifelong aversion to public conformity. Keaton never apologized for her stance, instead emphasizing that her view of Allen was shaped by decades of first-hand experience rather than public opinion. Her personal life, by contrast, grew quieter. Keaton never married, choosing instead to adopt 2 children in her 50s, Dexter and Duke, a decision she linked to the death of her father. She described motherhood as an unexpected form of reinvention, one that grounded her after decades of constant reinvention on screen. Even in the 1990s, when many of her contemporaries faded from prominence, Keaton's relevance persisted. Her performances in Father of the Bride and The First Wives Club reintroduced her to younger audiences, transforming her from avant-garde muse into mainstream maternal figure. Still eccentric, but now approachable. Hollywood's attitude toward her began to soften. The industry that once viewed her as unpredictable now marketed her individuality as timeless charm. Despite this, Keaton maintained her independence. She rarely appeared in projects that conformed to the expectations placed upon actresses of her age. In interviews, she consistently rejected nostalgia, preferring to talk about architecture, design, and photography rather than her filmography. Her public persona evolved from unconventional actress to creative polymath. Away from controversy, Keaton's later career took on a reflective tone. She appeared in films like Something's Gotta Give, where she portrayed independent women grappling with love and aging, roles that blurred the line between her real persona and the characters she embodied. The film resonated with audiences who had grown up with her, earning her critical acclaim and a Golden Globe. Her depiction of self-aware maturity offered a new archetype for older actresses: intelligent, humorous, and emotionally open without surrendering individuality. It was a thematic continuation of what she had introduced decades earlier in Annie Hall. The idea that imperfection, when embraced, becomes identity. Keaton's public image in her later years was marked by contradictions. She was deeply private yet endlessly expressive in her memoirs. She rejected vanity, but curated her image through meticulous fashion. She called herself insecure, yet projected confidence that younger performers openly admired. Her eccentricity, once labeled kooky, had by now become her trademark, a badge of authenticity in an era obsessed with artificial perfection. Allen, in turn, began to speak more openly about her influence on his life and work. In one of his final tributes, he referred to her as family, a statement that revealed more emotion than his usual detachment. It was an acknowledgement that their bond had outlasted the industry's cycles of scandal and renewal. To understand why Hollywood often turned its admiration for Keaton into hostility, one must look at what she represented. She wasn't malleable. She didn't seek validation from peers or audiences. Her authenticity made her magnetic, but also made the system uncomfortable. In an industry that rewarded compliance disguised as charm, Keaton's unfiltered individuality was treated as both asset and threat. Her collaborations with male auteurs positioned her within patriarchal structures, while she quietly redefined them from the inside. She became the emotional nucleus of films built around male neurosis, not by conforming to those narratives, but by exposing their fragility. In doing so, she subverted the very archetypes she was asked to embody. This tension between perception and reality, between muse and creator, between icon and individual, followed her throughout her career. Tributes to her achievements often frame them in relation to men, an irony not lost on cultural historians who later reassessed her legacy as one of quiet rebellion. When she received the AFI Lifetime Achievement Award, Allen's remarks encapsulated their shared paradox. Admiration, cloaked in humor, sentiment disguised as irony, he teased her about her fashion, her eccentricities, and her supposed lack of glamour, yet ended his speech with a confession. For the minute I met her, she was a great inspiration to me. Much of what I've accomplished in my life, I owe for sure to her. Keaton's legacy rests not on perfection, but on the authenticity she maintained across a half-century of performance. She refused to be simplified, refused to be remade, and in doing so forced Hollywood to evolve around her rather than the reverse. If the first act of her life was about defying expectations, the second was about sustaining that defiance in the face of adoration and judgment alike. Through every role, every interview, every eccentric choice, Diane Keaton embodied a rare truth that in a world obsessed with reinvention, the most radical act is to remain yourself. When news broke that Diane Keaton had died, tributes flooded social media and major publications. The narrative that emerged was both affectionate and retrospective, a recognition not only of her cinematic achievements, but of the paradox she embodied. Filmmaker Woody Allen, her longest creative collaborator, issued a statement that was striking in its simplicity. She was one of a kind. For Allen, the loss was deeply personal. Their intertwined history spanned half a century, beginning in a small Broadway theater and culminating in some of the most influential films in American cinema. The public response to Keaton's passing underscored how profoundly she had altered Hollywood's landscape. For decades, she had resisted reduction to type or archetype, carving out a space for women who could be intelligent, flawed, self-aware, and endearingly human all at once. In an industry historically obsessed with youth and conformity, she had made imperfection aspirational. Critics revisited her earliest interviews, tracing the same contradictions that made her enduringly relevant. The woman who avoided marriage yet became a defining figure of romantic cinema. The actress who played neurotic leads yet cultivated emotional steadiness off-screen. The style icon who dressed in ways designed to obscure allure rather than amplify it. Even in death, Keaton's image resisted idealization. Writers noted how her eccentricity had once been a liability, then a commodity, and finally a symbol of creative integrity. Retrospectives emphasized how she changed the vocabulary of on-screen femininity, how her performances rejected the polished ideal and embraced emotional realism decades before it became fashionable. Hollywood's tributes revealed the duality of her influence. Younger actresses cited her as a pioneer who made vulnerability powerful. Directors and writers credited her for expanding the emotional possibilities of female characters. Yet within these tributes lingered acknowledgement of an uncomfortable truth. For much of her career, Hollywood had not known what to do with Diane Keaton. Her relationship with Alan, long central to her public narrative, was re-examined with both reverence and discomfort. They had represented a creative era when intellectual storytelling and emotional intimacy coexisted, when humor and insecurity were intertwined.
She's never succumbed to any face work or anything, or any she's very uncompromising. She prefers to look old.
In their films together, Annie Hall, Manhattan, Play It Again, Sam, the line between fiction and autobiography blurred to the point of indistinction. Cultural historians highlighted how Keaton's very existence had reshaped the grammar of American film. Her speech patterns, pauses, and hesitations, once mocked as idiosyncrasies, had become recognizable emotional cues for authenticity. Her characters didn't deliver lines, they inhabited them. That spontaneity, so often mistaken for improvisation, was in fact a carefully crafted reflection of her worldview. That truth is found in imperfection. The industry's tone shifted from nostalgia to self-critique. Commentators acknowledged that the same system that celebrated her eccentricity had also marginalized it. Her refusal to conform, once framed as kooky, was now lauded as artistic courage. Younger actresses credited her with making space for individuality within a profession that still demands uniformity. Even beyond film, Keaton's influence persisted. Her fashion, the layered suits, oversized hats, and restrained palette re-emerged as symbols of personal identity over conformity. Designers cited her as an enduring muse, one whose style rejected the male gaze and redefined femininity through self-determination. The conversation around Keaton's legacy expanded to include broader reflections on gender, aging, and authenticity in Hollywood. Analysts observed that her death marked more than the end of a career. It marked the fading of an era defined by complexity, contradiction, and quiet rebellion. She had embodied a generation of artists who lived within contradiction rather than resolving it. For all the tributes and retrospectives, perhaps the most enduring image of Diane Keaton remains her acceptance speech at the Academy Awards for Annie Hall. She walked onto the stage in her trademark suit, nervous yet radiant, delivering words with the same halting rhythm that had become her signature. It wasn't just a moment of triumph. It was a visual declaration that individuality could coexist with success. Her legacy sits at the intersection of art and authenticity. In an era when celebrity often substitutes for substance, Keaton's work endures precisely because it resists simplification. She showed that self-awareness and vulnerability are not opposites but allies, and that being off-center, the term once used to dismiss her, is often the most truthful position to occupy. Diane Keaton's life and legacy now belong to that rare category of cultural stories that transcend filmography. The stories that become metaphors for resilience, for authenticity, for contradiction. Thanks for watching.